In the ancient world, power was never meant to be shared. It was seized, guarded, ritualized, and feared. Yet there came moments in history when power crossed a dangerous line, when kings no longer ruled as men, but demanded worship as gods. At first, this transformation appeared to strengthen empires. Loyalty deepened. Authority became unquestionable. Resistance felt sinful. But again and again, history shows us the same haunting pattern. The moment a king claimed divinity was often the moment an empire began to rot from within. This is a story when kings became gods, and how empires collapsed beneath the weight of their own worship. Long before written law or standing armies, early rulers were seen as intermediaries between heaven and earth. They were not gods themselves, but chosen, favored, blessed. In ancient Mesopotamia, kings claimed they were appointed by the gods to maintain cosmic order. In Egypt, the pharaoh was a living embodiment of divine harmony, the balance that kept the Nile flooding and the sun rising. In China, emperors ruled under the mandate of heaven, a sacred contract that could be revoked if the ruler failed. At first, divinity was symbolic. It legitimized authority. It unified people. It made obedience feel natural rather than forced. But over time, symbolism hardened into absolute belief. Kings stopped ruling for the gods and began ruling as gods. When that line was crossed, consequences followed. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was not merely king. He was Horus on earth, the son of Ra, the divine anchor holding the universe together. This belief forged one of the most stable civilizations in human history. For thousands of years, Egypt endured while others vanished. But divine kingship carried a fatal flaw. If the pharaoh was a god, then his word could not be questioned, even when it defied reality. During Egypt's Old Kingdom, pharaohs poured unimaginable wealth into their own divinity. Pyramids rose like mountains of stone, consuming labor, grain, and gold. The state existed to serve the god-king's afterlife. Taxes increased. Local governors gained power as the central court grew distant. When drought struck and the Nile failed, people did not blame nature. They blamed the divine ruler who had failed his sacred duty. If a god could fail, what did that make him? Faith cracked. Authority fractured. Egypt's first golden age collapsed into famine, rebellion, and decentralization. The god-king had fallen, not to enemies, but to reality. The same pattern unfolded in Mesopotamia. Early Sumerian kings ruled as stewards of the gods. But Akkadian ruler Naram-Sin shattered tradition. He declared himself a god while still alive, adopting divine titles and placing his image among the gods themselves. At first, it worked. His empire expanded. His enemies fell. His name inspired fear and reverence. But divinity isolated him. When invasions, droughts, and internal revolts struck, there was no one to blame but the god-king himself. His empire collapsed with shocking speed. Later generations called his reign the curse of Akkad, a warning etched into myth. When a king becomes a god, disaster follows. Centuries later, Rome would repeat the same mistake, on a far greater scale. The Roman Republic feared kingship. Power was shared, limited, and temporary. But as Rome expanded, generals became legends. Soldiers swore loyalty not to the state, but to men. Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon not just with an army, but with the belief that he was destined for greatness beyond law. After his assassination, Rome descended into chaos. Out of that chaos rose Augustus. He did not call himself a god, at least not in Rome, but across the empire. Temples were built in his name. His image became sacred. Loyalty to the emperor became loyalty to the divine order itself. Over time, emperors embraced this worship openly. Caligula demanded to be worshipped as a living god. Domitian insisted on being addressed as Lord and God. Refusal was treason. Worship was no longer spiritual. It was political. And that was a danger. When emperors became gods, criticism became heresy. Bad decisions went unchallenged. Corruption flourished. Reality bent to protect divine egos. As borders weakened and economies strained, emperors blamed enemies, minorities, and imagined conspiracies, never themselves. By the time Rome fell, it was not conquered by barbarians alone. It collapsed under the weight of divine rulers who could no longer hear truth. In ancient China, emperors were not gods, but the Son of Heaven. Their authority was sacred, but conditional. Floods, famines, and rebellions were signs that heaven had withdrawn its mandate. This system acted as a pressure valve. A ruler could be overthrown without destroying belief itself. Yet even here, emperors pushed too far. The Qin dynasty unified China through force and fear. The first emperor sought immortality, divine legacy, and absolute control. He burned books, buried scholars alive, and reshaped reality to fit his vision of eternal rule. But heaven does not tolerate hubris for long. His dynasty collapsed within years of his death, undone by revolts sparked by cruelty and divine arrogance. In Mesoamerica, kings ruled as living conduits to the gods. The Maya and Aztec believed rulers sustained the universe through ritual and blood. Human sacrifice fed the sun and kept time itself moving. As long as victories continued, faith remained strong. But when defeat came, when drought struck and enemies advanced, the illusion shattered. If kings were divine, why were the gods losing? Cities were abandoned, dynasties erased. The sacred calendars continued, but the rulers who claimed cosmic power vanished into jungle and dust. Across cultures, the pattern repeats. When rulers claim divine status, they remove the final limit on power. Law became sacred whim. Dissent became blasphemy. Empires turned inward, obsessed with ritual, image, and legacy rather than reality. The people suffered in silence, until silence turned to revolt. Divinity was meant to elevate kings above politics. Instead, it separated them from humanity, and humanity always returns. Even in medieval Europe, where kings ruled by the grace of God, the lesson endured. When monarchs pushed too far, they fell by rebellion, execution, or revolution. God kings gave way to constitutions, parliaments, and laws shaped by men rather than myths. Yet the temptation never disappeared. Every era produces leaders who believe themselves chosen, destined, above consequence. They may not claim godhood openly, but the language remains the same. Absolute authority, sacred destiny, infallibility. History warns us what follows. Empires do not collapse because kings become gods. Kings become gods because empires are already afraid of chaos, change, and truth. Divinity becomes armor against reality. But reality always finds a way in. Stone cracks, temples fall, names once worshipped become footnotes, and the gods return to dust. Because no empire survives when its rulers forget they are human. As the centuries rolled forward, the lesson should have been clear, yet humanity rarely learned from power's most seductive illusion, the belief that authority is sacred, unquestionable, eternal. Again and again, rulers step beyond mortality, cloaking themselves in divinity to silence fear, dissent, and doubt. And each time, the same slow collapse followed. In the ancient Near East, Assyrian kings carved their godlike image into stone. They were not merely rulers. They were chosen instruments of divine wrath. Reliefs showed kings towering over enemies, lions crushed beneath their feet, cities burned in ritual violence. Fear was worship. Obedience was survival. The king was the will of the gods made flesh. For a time, this terror worked. Assyria became the most feared empire of its age. But divine kingship demands constant proof. Endless conquest, endless punishment, endless blood. When expansion slowed and enemies adapted, fear turned inward, provinces revolted, armies defected. The gods who once sanctioned cruelty were suddenly silent. Nineveh fell so completely that later generations forgot it had ever existed. In Persia, the great kings styled themselves as chosen by Ahura Mazda, defenders of cosmic truth against chaos. Unlike other divine rulers, they practiced tolerance, law, and restraint. For a while, balance held. But even here, divine favor bred distance. Later kings retreated into ceremony, luxury, and absolute belief in destiny. When Alexander arrived, claiming divine lineage himself, the empire collapsed with startling speed. The gods had chosen another. Alexander of Macedon began as a man, a brilliant general, a fearless commander. But conquest changed him. Oracles declared him the son of Zeus. Soldiers bowed. Cities worshipped. He adopted divine dress, divine rituals, divine entitlement. Those who resisted were executed, not for treason, but for sacrilege. Yet divinity isolated him. Friends became subjects. Advisors became worshippers. By the time he died, his empire existed only in his shadow. Without the God King, it shattered instantly. His generals fought over fragments of divinity, not unity. An empire held together by worship cannot survive the death of its god. In Japan, emperors claimed descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu. For centuries, this divine lineage unified the nation. But real power shifted to shoguns, men who rule without divinity, but with force. The god emperor became a symbol, distant and silent. When modern war exposed the myth, Japan faced a profound reckoning. After World War II, the emperor renounced his divinity publicly. The empire survived only by abandoning the illusion. In Southeast Asia, the concept of the God King reached architectural extremes. Angkor's rulers built temples that mirrored the universe itself. Kings were living manifestations of Shiva or Vishnu. The capital was not just a city, it was the cosmos made stone. But maintaining a divine empire required endless labor and obedience. When environmental change disrupted water systems, the sacred order failed. The God Kings lost legitimacy. Angkor was swallowed by jungle. Nature does not bow to divinity. Across Africa, sacred kings ruled as living spirits whose health determined the land's fertility. If crops failed or disease spread, the king himself could be killed to restore balance. Here, divinity was a burden, not a shield. It recognized a truth other empires ignored. A ruler is responsible, and failure has consequences. But where kings reversed that logic, claiming divinity without accountability, collapse was inevitable. In every civilization, divine kingship followed the same arc. First came unity, then obedience, then silence. Advisors stopped warning. Priests stopped questioning. People stopped believing, but continued pretending. Empires rotted beneath gold and ceremony, unable to adapt, unable to admit weakness. The moment a ruler cannot be wrong, the state begins to fail. Empires fall not in a single dramatic moment, but in layers. Faith erodes. Loyalty becomes fear. Ritual replaces reform. The God King speaks, but the world no longer listens. When collapse finally arrives, it feels sudden. Cities burn. Thrones fall. Dynasties end. But the true collapse happened long before, when rulers chose worship over wisdom. History does not condemn belief. It condemns arrogance. The most enduring civilizations were those that placed limits on power, laws stronger than kings, traditions that allowed correction, systems that accepted human failure. Where rulers remembered they were mortal, empires adapted. Where rulers declared themselves divine, reality eventually rebelled, and it always does. Today, temples may be gone and crowns replaced by suits, but the pattern remains. Absolute power still seeks sacred language. Leaders still claim destiny, inevitability, infallibility, and societies still pay the price when truth becomes forbidden. The past is not warning us about gods. It is warning us about forgetting we are human. As empires expanded and time pressed forward, divine kingship did not disappear. It evolved. The language softened, the rituals changed, but the danger remained the same. Wherever rulers wrapped themselves in sacred inevitability, decline followed quietly, patiently, and then all at once. In the Byzantine Empire, emperors ruled as God's chosen regents on earth. They were not gods themselves, but their authority was wholly untouchable. The emperor stood between heaven and humanity, crowned by divine will. To challenge him was to challenge God's order. This belief preserved unity for centuries, but also paralyzed reform. Military failures were explained as divine tests. Economic collapse was met with prayer rather than policy. When enemies adapted faster than belief, Constantinople slowly bled power, until faith alone could no longer hold the walls. Sacred authority delayed collapse, but could not prevent it. In medieval Europe, kings ruled by divine right. Crowns were blessed, thrones sanctified, law flowed downward from heaven through royal blood. For generations, this belief maintained order. But when famine, plague, and war exposed royal helplessness, people began to question a dangerous idea. If God chose kings, why were kings failing so badly? The answer shattered kingdoms. Revolutions did not begin as rebellions against rulers, but against divinity itself. The French Revolution was not merely political. It was theological. The king was no longer sacred. He was human, and humans could be judged. Once the illusion broke, there was no return. In South America, the Inca emperor was a child of the sun. His presence ensured harmony between heaven and earth. Roads, temples, and cities radiated from his divine center. But when the emperor was captured by a handful of strangers, the empire froze. A god could not be imprisoned. A god could not be replaced. Leadership collapsed instantly, not because the Incas lacked strength, but because their system allowed no alternative to divinity. An empire that worships one man cannot survive his fall. Even religions themselves were shaped by the failure of god-kings. Early spiritual movements often emerged as reactions against rulers who claimed sacred authority. Prophets spoke truth to kings. Teachers rejected earthly divinity. Faith became a refuge from power rather than its weapon. But power always learns. Over time, rulers absorbed religious language again. Titles changed, crowns returned. Ceremonies grew grander. The cycle resumed. When leaders believe themselves chosen, dissent becomes treason. When authority is sacred, accountability vanishes. When truth threatens divinity, truth is silenced. This is how empires truly collapse, not from invasion, but from isolation. Divine kings stop listening. They surround themselves with echoes. They mistake applause for loyalty, silence for peace, ritual for stability. By the time reality breaks through, the structure is already hollow. History shows us something unsettling. People will tolerate cruelty longer than arrogance. They will endure hardship, war, and sacrifice, but not humiliation. When rulers claim perfection while people suffer, resentment hardens into inevitability. No god-king has ever fallen gracefully. Their statues are pulled down, their temples burned, their names erased, not because people hated belief, but because belief had been abused. Even myths remember this truth. Stories across cultures warn of mortals who sought godhood and were destroyed by it. These are not fantasies. They are historical memories wrapped in metaphor. The message is always the same. Power must kneel to reality, or reality will rise against it. Empires that endure are not those with divine rulers, but those with limits. Limits on authority, limits on ambition, limits enforced not by heaven, but by people. When kings became gods, they gained worship, but lost wisdom. They gained fear, but lost loyalty. They gained silence, but lost survival. And so the pattern repeats across time, carved into ruins, whispered in legends, buried beneath fallen capitals. The rise begins with awe. The fall begins with silence. And the end arrives when the gods can no longer save themselves. Because history, unlike kings, does not bow. As the echoes of fallen god-kings faded into ruins and legends, the pattern did not end. It only changed masks. History moved forward, but human nature remained stubbornly the same. Wherever power concentrated itself beyond question, wherever leaders wrapped authority in sacred inevitability, the slow machinery of collapse began turning once more. In Islamic caliphates, rulers were not gods, nor could they claim divinity. Yet some caliphs came to see themselves as a shadow of God on earth, absolute guardians of divine order. Early caliphates thrived when rulers lived modestly, listened to scholars, and accepted correction. But as empires expanded, caliphs withdrew behind palace walls. Ceremony replaced justice. Advisors became flatterers. Religious authority was bent to protect power rather than guide it. When legitimacy rests on sacred authority, failure becomes unforgivable. Rebellions multiplied. Provinces broke away. What began as a unified spiritual political order fractured into rival dynasties, each claiming divine correctness, none willing to admit error. Sacred certainty left no room for repair. In India, kingship often blended politics with cosmic duty. Rulers were protectors of Dharma, the moral order of the universe. This belief could restrain tyranny, but only if rulers accepted responsibility. When kings instead used religion to justify excess, corruption hollowed empires from within. Dynasties fell not because belief was strong, but because belief had been emptied of humility. The lesson was ancient and universal. Divinity without accountability poisons power. Even colonial empires adopted the language of destiny. Empires claimed they were chosen to civilize, enlighten, or uplift the world. This was not godhood in name, but in function. Moral superiority replaced divine ancestry. Conquest became duty. Exploitation became righteousness. And collapse followed. Colonial powers did not fall only because they were resisted. They fell because their belief in their own inevitability blinded them. They could not imagine a world without themselves. By the time reality forced that imagination upon them, their authority had already dissolved. In the modern age, the God King rarely wears a crown. He wears ideology. Totalitarian states created leaders whose images filled streets, whose words were sacred, whose mistakes were unthinkable. History was rewritten to protect them. Truth became treason. Loyalty became worship. Entire nations were bent around the ego of one man. The result was always the same. Fear replaced faith. Lies replaced law. Collapse came not only in defeat, but in moral ruin. When the illusion broke, it broke violently, leaving generations to rebuild from silence and shame. This is a hidden cost of God kingship. It does not merely destroy empires. It scars memory. People who live under sacred authority learn to doubt truth, distrust leadership, and fear belief itself. When the God falls, faith does not simply vanish, it shatters. And yet, despite all this, humanity keeps reaching for the same temptation, because divinity offers something intoxicating: certainty. In a chaotic world, a God King promises order, meaning, protection, the promise that someone somewhere is in control. But history whispers a warning beneath that promise. No human can carry the weight of being a god. Empires that survive longest are not those that claim perfection, but those that tolerate failure. They allow leaders to be wrong. They allow systems to bend. They allow truth to travel upward, not just commands downward. The moment a ruler believes himself above consequence, consequence becomes inevitable. When kings became gods, they did not fall because the heavens struck them down. They fell because they stopped listening, stopped adapting, stopped seeing the people beneath them as human equals. Empires collapse when power forgets its limits. They crumble when authority demands worship instead of trust. They vanish when leaders fear truth more than rebellion. And in the end, all God Kings face the same judgment, not from heaven, but from history. Their crowns rust. Their temples decay. Their names survive only as warnings. Because history remembers this truth above all others. Power survives humility. Empires survive accountability. But gods made of men always fall. Long after the ruins are swallowed by sand and forest, long after names are reduced to fragments on stone, the same question lingers beneath history's surface. Why do societies keep surrendering themselves to the illusion of divine power? The answer lies not in kings, but in fear. When times are stable, rulers are merely administrators. But when uncertainty spreads, famine, invasion, disease, collapse of old systems, people search for certainty. And nothing feels more certain than divinity. A god does not hesitate. A god does not doubt. A god promises meaning in chaos. This is when rulers stop being leaders and begin becoming symbols. And symbols are dangerous. In times of crisis, kings who claimed godhood were not merely worshipped. They were needed. The population did not just obey them. They emotionally depended on them. The ruler became the embodiment of hope itself. But hope tied to one man is fragile. When that man falters, hope collapses with him. This is why God kings often rose during moments of transition, and why their reigns ended in disaster. In late antiquity, as old pagan systems weakened and new religions spread, emperors struggled to hold fractured worlds together. Some tried compromise. Others chose absolutism. They fused state identity and sacred authority into a single figure. The ruler was no longer just lawgiver, but cosmic anchor. And yet, this fusion always created a fatal contradiction. If the ruler is divine, then suffering must have meaning. If suffering has meaning, reform is unnecessary. If reform is unnecessary, decay becomes permanent. Empires governed by god-kings do not fail quickly. They fail quietly. Roads crack, armies weaken, markets shrink, but the rituals continue unchanged. The ceremonies grow grander even as foundations erode. This creates the illusion of strength long after strength is gone. By the time collapse becomes visible, it is irreversible. One of the most tragic aspects of divine rulership is how it destroys the truth. Advisors who speak honestly risk not just punishment, but sacrilege. Historians are forced to lie. Priests become mouthpieces. Reality is rewritten daily to protect the myth of perfection. This is why so many divine empires appear strong right until the moment they vanish. They did not fall suddenly. They were already dead. They just had not admitted it. Even resistance movements understood this. Rebels rarely attack god-kings as rulers. They attack them as false gods. They expose weakness, mortality, and contradiction. They mock divinity. Because once the illusion cracks, obedience evaporates. A god who bleeds is no god at all. This is why executions of divine rulers were so symbolic. They were not just political acts. They were spiritual ones. Public, deliberate, final. They told the people, "He is mortal. He always was." And once people accept that truth, everything changes. After the fall of god-kings, societies often swing to extremes. Some reject authority entirely. Others seek new idols. Strongmen, ideologies, movements that promise certainty without admitting fallibility. The gods change names, but not function. History becomes a loop. But there are rare moments when civilizations learn. They build systems instead of idols. They distribute power instead of concentrating it. They protect criticism instead of punishing it. They value truth over reverence. These societies are never perfect, but they survive longer. They adapt. They correct themselves. They do not need gods in human form to endure. The ruins of divine empires teach us this lesson again and again. The tallest monuments are often built by rulers who feared being forgotten. The largest temples were raised by those desperate to eternalize their authority. Yet those same monuments stand today as evidence not of power, but failure. Stone remembers what people forget. When kings became gods, they sought immortality. What they achieved instead was inevitability, because every god-king faced the same end. Their reigns ended. Their worship faded. Their empires collapsed. Not because humanity rejected belief, but because humanity refused to remain silent forever. And so the story continues across time, carved into the memory of the world. The moment power demands worship. The moment leaders rise beyond question. The moment authority declares itself sacred. That is the moment an empire begins to fall. Not with fire, not with invasion, but with the quiet certainty that no human was ever meant to be a god. Even after countless collapses, humanity continued to circle the same dangerous idea that if power could be made sacred, it could be made permanent. Yet permanence is the one thing history never grants. As empires aged, divine rulership began to rely less on belief and more on performance. Kings staged miracles. Courts manufactured omens. Priests interpreted every coincidence as proof of sacred favor. The state became a theater, and the ruler its central myth. What mattered was not truth, but appearance. As long as the god-king looked eternal, the empire pretended to be the same. But reality does not care for theater. When crops failed, when borders weakened, when disease spread, the god-king's divinity was tested in the most unforgiving court imaginable, the daily lives of ordinary people. Hunger does not listen to prayers spoken by rulers. War does not pause for rituals. Nature exposes false gods with ruthless honesty. This is why divine empires often collapse during environmental stress. Droughts, floods, earthquakes, and plagues stripped away the illusion faster than armies ever could. When suffering became widespread, belief turned inward and corrosive. People did not immediately rebel, they doubted. And doubt is far more dangerous to divine authority than open resistance. Doubt spreads quietly. It cannot be executed. It cannot be silenced. In many societies, The first sign of collapse was not rebellion, but satire, whispered jokes, private mockery, secret songs. When people begin to laugh at their gods, power has already lost its grip. Reverence is fragile. Once broken, it cannot be commanded back. God-kings feared ridicule more than revolt. This fear drove them to extremes. Purges intensified, laws tightened, surveillance increased. The sacred ruler demanded ever louder affirmations of loyalty. Statues multiplied, titles grew longer, ceremonies became more elaborate. The empire looked powerful, but only because it was terrified. The louder the worship, the weaker the faith. History shows that divine rulers rarely recognized collapse when it began. Surrounded by worshippers, insulated by ritual and protected by fear, they mistook silence for stability. Reports were softened. Failures blamed on traitors or fate. The god could not be wrong, so reality had to be. This is how empires lose the ability to correct themselves. A mortal ruler can apologize. A divine ruler cannot. And without correction, mistakes compound. One poor decision requires another to hide it. One lie demands 10 more to protect it. Eventually, the structure becomes so fragile that even a small shock shatters everything. When collapse finally comes, it feels shocking only to those at the center. To the people at the edges, the farmers, soldiers, traders, it feels overdue. The fall of god-kings often triggered cultural trauma. Generations raised to believe in sacred rulers struggled to rebuild trust in leadership at all. Cynicism replaced faith. Obedience turned into suspicion. Societies had to relearn a simple truth that divinity had erased. Leaders are servants, not saviors. Some civilizations never fully recovered. Yet history also records moments of transformation. After the fall of divine rule, new ideas emerged: citizenship, law, shared governance, accountability. These concepts were not born from idealism, but from exhaustion. Humanity learned painfully that worship is a poor substitute for wisdom. Still, the temptation never vanished, because divine power offers one thing no system can promise: certainty without effort. It absolves people of responsibility. If the ruler is a god, then outcomes are fate, not failure. This is why societies under stress keep reaching for sacred authority. It is comforting, it is simple, and it is catastrophic. Every collapsed empire leaves behind the same warning, written in ruins rather than words. No ruler is chosen by the universe. No authority is eternal. No power survives isolation from truth. When kings became gods, they sought to escape the limits of being human. But it was those very limits, doubt, humility, accountability, that once made their rule possible. And so history turns, again and again, reminding us of its oldest lesson. The moment power demands worship, it loses legitimacy. The moment leaders rise beyond question, they abandon reality. The moment humanity kneels to its own creations, collapse becomes inevitable. Empires are not destroyed by enemies alone. They are undone when men forget they are not gods. As the long arc of history stretches forward, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Divine power does not fail loudly at first. It fails invisibly. It erodes trust, distorts reality, and slowly hollows out the very foundations it claims to protect. God-kings often believe their greatest threat was rebellion. In truth, it was stagnation. Because when power is sacred, innovation becomes dangerous. New ideas threaten established order. Reform implies past mistakes, and mistakes imply imperfection. A divine ruler cannot afford imperfection. So change is delayed, resisted, or crushed. Laws grow rigid. Institutions freeze. The empire becomes a monument rather than a living system. And monuments do not adapt. Military structures suffer first. Armies once forged by necessity become ceremonial. Promotions are granted for loyalty, not competence. Generals learn to please the throne rather than prepare for war. When real conflict arrives, divine confidence meets human limitation and loses. Economic decline follows. Sacred rulers often surround themselves with grandeur while ignoring trade, infrastructure, and labor. Wealth flows upward to sustain ritual and image. Taxes rise to fund monuments, temples, and pageantry. The people carry the burden of divinity, while the ruler enjoys its privileges. Resentment grows quietly, yet divine rulers rarely sense it. Worship creates distance. Fear filters information. The God King hears only praise. He sees only crowds assembled on command. He mistakes obedience for devotion, silence for consent. By the time resentment becomes visible, it is already hardened into inevitability. This is why so many God Kings were shocked when their empires collapsed. They did not see betrayal coming, because they believed betrayal was impossible. How could a god be abandoned? How could the chosen fall? But belief does not replace bread. Faith does not replace security. Ritual does not replace justice. When these needs go unmet, belief turns into bitterness. History also reveals another uncomfortable truth. Divine rule does not merely corrupt rulers. It reshapes entire societies. People raised under sacred authority learn to wait rather than act, to obey rather than question, to endure rather than demand. When the god falls, the people are left disoriented, unsure how to govern themselves. This is a hidden legacy of god kings, dependence. Some civilizations escaped this trap. They learned, slowly, painfully, that power must be divisible, challengeable, temporary. They replaced divine rulers with laws, councils, courts, and constitutions. These systems were imperfect, often flawed, sometimes unjust, but they allowed correction. Correction is survival. Others did not learn. They replaced one god with another, one sacred ruler with another sacred idea. The cycle repeated under new names. Because the impulse behind divine power is not political, it is psychological. It is a desire to believe someone else is in control, that someone else knows best. That responsibility can be surrendered, but history does not reward surrender. Empires rise when leaders are accountable. They endure when truth can travel upward. They adapt when authority listens. Empires collapse when leaders are worshipped, when truth becomes dangerous, when power isolates itself from reality. This is why the fall of god kings feels so final. Once worship ends, nothing remains to hold the structure together. No trust, no legitimacy, no shared responsibility. Only ruins and regret. The greatest irony is this. Kings became gods to escape human weakness, but it was their refusal to accept human weakness that destroyed them. Mortality teaches restraint. Fallibility invites counsel. Limits create balance. Divinity erases all three. And so, across deserts, forests, mountains, and seas, the same story is written again and again, not as myth, but as pattern, not as legend, but as warning. When kings become gods, empires do not fall because heaven intervenes. They fall because reality does. Slowly, patiently, inevitably, and history, watching from ruins, records a verdict without mercy. No throne survives worship. No empire endures illusion. No man escapes the cost of pretending to be a god. In the final chapters of every divine empire, there is a moment rarely recorded in chronicles or carved into stone. It is quiet, ordinary, almost invisible, and yet it is the true point of no return. It is the moment when belief becomes habit. People no longer worship because they believe. They worship because they must. They repeat prayers, attend ceremonies, bow to images, not out of faith, but survival. The sacred has become routine, and routine has hollowed it out. The God King still stands at the center of the world, but the world has already moved on in spirit. This is the most dangerous phase of divine power, because a god sustained by fear alone is already dead. At this stage, empires often appear strongest. Borders may still hold. Armies may still march. Monuments still shine. But beneath the surface, something essential has vanished. Emotional loyalty. The people no longer feel connected to the ruler's fate. They endure him, nothing more. When crisis arrives, and it always does, this indifference proves fatal. A flood destroys crops. A defeat shatters an army. A rival exposes weakness. A rumor spreads faster than truth. And suddenly, the god feels small. In these moments, divine rulers often double down. They demand greater sacrifices, louder loyalty, harsher punishments. They insist the people have failed the God, not the other way around. The burden of collapse is pushed downward onto those least able to carry it. This accelerates the end. History shows that the final collapse of god kings is rarely heroic. There is no thunder, no divine reckoning. There is abandonment. Courtiers flee. Soldiers hesitate. Priests change their words. The ruler looks out from his palace or temple and realizes, too late, that worship cannot save him. The god is alone. And in that loneliness, the truth becomes unavoidable. Divinity was never real. It was an agreement, a story shared by ruler and ruled. And once the rule withdraws from the story, it ends instantly. This is why divine empires collapse faster than rational ones. They have no backup plan, no shared ownership, no resilience. Everything rests on belief, and belief can evaporate overnight. After the fall, societies are forced to confront the damage left behind. Institutions weakened by obedience, knowledge suppressed by reverence, generations taught to wait instead of act. Rebuilding takes longer than conquest ever did. Yet from the ashes, something new sometimes emerges. A quieter understanding of power, a suspicion of absolutes, a respect for limits. These societies remember, not perfectly, but enough, that no leader should be beyond question, no authority beyond challenge, no system beyond reform. Their memory becomes their shield. Others forget. They raise new idols. They rename old gods. They repeat the ritual with different words. And so the cycle waits patiently, because the temptation of divine power never truly disappears. It waits for fear, for chaos, for uncertainty. It waits for the moment when people are tired, desperate, and willing to believe that someone, anyone, can rise above humanity and save them from it. History's answer is always the same. No one can. When kings became gods, they tried to escape the limits that define leadership. But it was those limits, humility, accountability, doubt, that once made their rule possible. Empires are built by humans working together. They endure through correction and compromise. They collapse when power isolates itself behind sacred walls. And so, written across millennia of ruins, fallen capitals, erased dynasties, and forgotten names, one final truth remains. The moment a ruler demands worship, he abandons responsibility. The moment a society accepts that demand, it surrenders its future. And the moment kings become gods, empires begin their long, inevitable fall, not with fire, not with prophecy, but with the quiet realization that no throne was ever meant to touch the heavens.